Ron Goldfarb is a publisher, an author, and an attorney, and he's an Old Town resident. He lives very nearby, and this is Judge Woolsey's decision. The podium is yours.
So good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many people coming out on a rainy day with football games, baseball games, religious observances for some, to talk about a subject near and dear to my heart as both a writer and a lawyer who represents writers. I stopped by a few days ago, and there was a young woman here doing a lecture about banned books in antiquity, which was fascinating to hear. And you'd like to think that that's a subject that, like beheadings, happened hundreds of years ago, but like beheadings, unfortunately, that's not the case. I have an article here from the organization who runs the banned books, that since 1982, when this organization started, 11,300 books have been banned. And that includes things you might expect, as well as The Great Gatsby and Grapes of Wrath and Tropic of Cancer and whatnot. And they conclude their remarks in this report with something that I thought captured the spirit of the evening. Censorship is about more than a single book. It is about the intellectual, cultural, and political life of the community and the people in it. Each time a book is removed, it reinforces the idea that books and ideas are off limits if someone doesn't like them. It contributes to a culture where it's better to hide from controversial or difficult topics than to acknowledge or discuss them. Restricting or banning books hurts kids and education because teachers and librarians may decide not to teach or buy another book if they feel it would be educational and enjoyable. So it's rare that lawyers and judges are ahead of the wave on social issues, but I thought, since you're going to be hearing about a lot of specific books, it would be interesting to read to you, not the whole opinion, but a few excerpts from one of the landmark cases on banned books. The name of the case was United States of America against one book called Ulysses and Random House Incorporated. And it arose out of a violation of the Tariff Act of 1930, barring obscene books and not allowing them to be imported into the United States. So this book was blocked, and the publisher and the author brought the case before the court, and Judge Woolsey, an old-fashioned judge, quite an intellectual one, had some very interesting observations. I thought they were worth reading to you. He dismissed the case, not to hold you at the edge of your seat. But here are some of his remarks. I have read Ulysses once in its entirety, and I have read those passages of which the government particularly complains several times. In fact, for many weeks, my spare time has been devoted to the consideration of the decision which my duty would require me to make in this matter. Ulysses is not an easy book to read or to understand, but there has been much written about it, and in order to properly approach the consideration of it, it is advisable to read a number of other books which have now become its satellites. The study of Ulysses is therefore a heavy task. The reputation of Ulysses in the literary world, however, warranted my taking such time as was necessary to enable me to satisfy myself as to the intent with which the book was written. For of course, in any case where a book is claimed to be obscene, it must be first determined whether the intent with which it was written was what is called, according to the usual phrase, pornographic. That is, written for the purpose of exploiting obscenity. An aside, that is not the rule now, and it's almost quaint when we're reading books like 50 Shades of Grey to try to define or bar obscenity. If the conclusion is that the book is pornographic, that is the end of the inquiry, and forfeiture must follow. But in Ulysses, in spite of its unusual frankness, I do not detect anywhere the leer of the sensualist. I hold, therefore, that it is not pornographic. He then goes on to discuss some of the analysis, which I don't think will be interesting, but then he comes to a nice part. For his attempt sealely and honestly to realize his objective has required him, incidentally, to use certain words which are generally considered dirty words, and has led at times to what many think is too poignant preoccupation with sex in the thoughts of his characters. The words which are criticized as dirty are old Saxon words, known to almost all men, and I venture to many women, and are such words as would be naturally and habitually used, I believe, by the types of folk whose life, physical and mental, Joyce is seeking to describe. In respect of the current emergence of the theme of sex in the minds of his characters, this is a good one, it must always be remembered that his locale was Celtic and the season spring. Whether or not one enjoys such a technique as Joyce uses is a matter of taste on which disagreement or argument is futile. But to subject that technique to the standards of some other techniques seems to me a little short of absurd. Accordingly, I hold that Ulysses is a sincere and honest book, and I think the criticisms of it are entirely disposed of by its rationale. Ulysses is an amazing tour de force when one considers the success which has been in the main achieved with such a difficult objective as Joyce set for himself. As I've stated, Ulysses is not an easy book to read. It is brilliant and dull, intelligible, and obscure by turns. In many places it seems to me disgusting, although it contains, as I've mentioned before, many words usually considered dirty. I have not found anything that I consider to be dirt for dirt's sake. Each word of the book contributes a little bit of mosaic to the detail of the picture which Joyce is seeking to construct for his readers. If one does not wish to associate with such folk, as Joyce describes, that is one's choice. In order to avoid indirect contact with them, one may not wish to read Ulysses. That is quite understandable, but when such a real artist in words as Joyce undoubtedly is, seeks to draw a true picture of the lower middle class in a European city, would it be impossible for the American public legally to see that picture? The answer to this question is not sufficiently merely to find, as I have found above, that Joyce did not write Ulysses with what is commonly called pornographic intent. I must endeavor to apply a more objective standard to his book in order to determine its effect in the result, irrespective of the purpose for which it was written. He's on and on. He applies a certain test that isn't applied now, so I'll leave it out. I'm quite aware that owing to some of its scenes, Ulysses is a rather strong draft to ask some sensitive, though normal persons to take. But my considered opinion, after long reflection, is that whilst in many places the effect of Ulysses on the reader undoubtedly is somewhat emetic, nowhere does it tend to be aphrodisiac. Ulysses may therefore be admitted into the United States. I thought it was a very charming opinion. The result is one that I think would be followed today. The rationale would not at all. Now, if you want, I mean, I could take questions now, or do you not? Do you want to do that later, or?
You know, although we have a discussion planned for later, since Ron has to leave, would anyone like to ask him a question now? I think they all just completely agree with you. I do. And with Judge Woolsey. And our next reader is Rose Dawson, the leader of the Alexandria Libraries.
That's a nice description of leader of the Alexandria Libraries. Good evening. My name is Rose Dawson, and I'm the director of the Alexandria Library. And I would like to share with you all this evening the Caldecott Award-winning book, Sylvester and the Magic Pebble, by William Steig. And afterwards, I'm going to read excerpts, and afterwards maybe you can explain to me why this book was actually challenged and placed on the banned book list. Sylvester Duncan lived with his mother and father at Acorn Road in Oatsdale. One of his hobbies was collecting pebbles of unusual shape and color. On a rainy Saturday during vacation, he found a quite extraordinary one. It was flaming red, shiny, and perfectly round, like a marble. As he was studying that remarkable pebble, he began to shiver, probably from excitement, and the rain felt cold on his back. "I wish it would stop raining," he said. To his great surprise, the rain stopped. In all his young life, Sylvester had never had a wish gratified so quickly. This must be the work of magic, and indeed it was. What a lucky day this is, thought Sylvester. From now on, I can have anything I want. He wished the sunshine back in the sky, and he wished a wart on his left hind fetlock would disappear, and it did. He started home, eager to amaze his father and mother with his magic pebble. As he was crossing Strawberry Hill, thinking of some of the many, many things he could wish for, he was startled to see a mean, hungry lion looking right at him from behind some tall grass. He was frightened. If he hadn't been so frightened, he could have made the lion disappear. Or he could have wished himself safe at home with his father and mother. He could have wished the lion would turn into a butterfly or a daisy or a gnat. He could have wished many things, but he panicked and couldn't think carefully. I wish I were a rock, he said, and he became a rock. The lion came bounding over, sniffing the rock 100 times, walked around and around it, and went away confused, perplexed, puzzled, and bewildered. I saw that little donkey as clear as day. Maybe I'm going crazy, he muttered. And there was Sylvester, a rock on Strawberry Hill, with the magic pebble lying right beside him on the ground, and he was unable to pick it up. Meanwhile, back at home, Mr. and Mrs. Duncan paced the floor, frantic with worry. For Sylvester had never come home later than dinner time. Where could he be? They stayed up all night. At dawn, they went about inquiring of all the neighbors. They talked to all the children, the puppies, the kittens, the colts, the piglets. No one had seen Sylvester since the day before yesterday. They went to the police. The police could not find their child. All the dogs in Oatsdale went searching for him. They sniffed behind every rock and tree and blade of grass, into every nook and gully of the neighborhood and beyond, but found no scent of Sylvester. Night followed day, and day followed night over and over again. Sylvester woke up on the hill. When he was awake, he was only hopeless and unhappy. He felt he would be a rock forever. Then it was winter. The winds blew this way and that. It snowed. Mostly the animals stayed indoors, living on the food they had stored up. Then the snows melted. The earth warmed up in the spring sun and things budded. Leaves were on the trees again. Flowers showed their young faces. One day in May, Mr. Duncan insisted that his wife go with him on a picnic. Let's cheer up. Let's try to live happy again. They went to Strawberry Hill. Mrs. Duncan sat down on the rock. Mr. Duncan walked aimlessly about while Mrs. Duncan set out the picnic food on the rock. Alfalfa sandwiches, pickled oats, sassafras salad, and Timothy compote. Suddenly, Mr. Duncan saw the red pebble. What a fantastic pebble, he exclaimed. Sylvester would loved this for his collection. He put the pebble on the rock. They sat down to eat. Sylvester was now as wide awake as a donkey. That was a rock. As wide awake as a donkey that was a rock could possibly be. Mrs. Duncan felt some mysterious excitement. Oh, how I wish he was here with us on this lovely May Day, she said. Don't you, Father? Sylvester thought, I wish I were myself again. I wish I were my real self again. And in less than an instant, he was. You can imagine the scene that followed. The embraces, the kisses, the questions, the answers, the loving looks, and the fond exclamations. When they had eventually calmed down a bit and had gotten home, Mr. Duncan put the magic pebble in an iron safe. Someday they might want to use it, but really, for now, what more could they wish for? They all had all that they wanted. And that's the end of Sylvester and the Magic Pebble.
Donese Stevens is a native Alexandrian and a stage and on-camera actress too. Yeah. And she's got a book that she's going to read for you.
Good evening. The Lorax by Dr. Seuss is one of his longer stories. It was very difficult for me to figure out where to start, what to say. So somebody said, split it down the middle. And I think that's what I'm going to try to do this evening. The Lorax by Dr. Seuss. At the far end of town, where the grickle grass grows and the wind smells slow and sour when it blows, and no birds ever sing excepting old crows, is the street of the lifted Lorax. And deep in the grickle grass, some people say, if you look deep enough, you can see today where the Lorax once stood, just as long as it could, before someone lifted the Lorax away. What was the Lorax? And why was it there? And why was it lifted and taken somewhere from the far end of town where the grickle grass grows? The old Onceler still lives there. Ask him. He knows. You won't see the Onceler. Don't knock at his door. He stays in his lurkum on top of the store. He lurks in his lurkum, cold under the roof, where he makes his own clothes out of muffled moof. And on special dank midnights in August, he peeks out of the shutters, and sometimes he speaks and tells how the Lorax was lifted away. He'll tell you, perhaps, if you're willing to pay. On the end of the rope, he lets down a tin pail, and you have to toss in 15 cents and a nail, and the shell of a great-great-great-grandfather's snail. And when he pulls up the pail and makes a most careful count to see if you paid the proper amount, then he hides what you've paid him away in his snub, his secret strange hole, in his gruvulous grub. And then he grunts, I will call you by my whisper-ma-phone, for the secrets I tell you are for your ears alone. Slop! Down slops the whisper-ma-phone to your ear, and the old Onceler's whispers are not very clear, since they have to come down through a snarkly hose, and he sounds as if he has smallish bees in his nose. Now, I'll tell you, he says, with his teeth sounding gray, how the Lorax got lifted and taken away. It all started way back, such a long, long time ago, way back in the days when the grass was still green and the pond was still wet and the clouds were still clean and the song of the swarmy swans rang out in space. One morning, I came to this glorious place, and I first saw the trees, the truffle of trees, the bright-colored tufts of the truffle of trees, mile after mile in the fresh morning breeze. And under the trees, I saw brown barbaloots frisking around in their barbaloot suits as they played in the shades of the truffle of fruits. From the rippleless pond came the comfortable sound of the humming fish humming while splashing around. But those trees, those truffle of trees, all my life I've been searching for trees such as these. The touch of their tufts was much softer than silk, and they had the sweet smell of fresh butterfly milk. I felt a great leaping of joy in my heart. I knew just what I'd do. I unloaded my cart. In no time at all, I had built a small shop. Then I chopped down a truffle tree with one chop. And with great skillful skill, and with great speedy speed, I took the soft tub, and I knitted a need. The instant I finished, I heard a gazump. I looked, I saw something pop out of a stump. Of a tree I chopped down. It was sort of a man. Describe him, that's hard. I don't know if I can. He was shortish and oldish and brownish and mossy. And he spoke with a voice that was both sharpish and bossy. Mister, he said with a sawdusty sneeze, I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. I speak for the trees have no tongues, and I'm asking you, sir, at the top of my lungs. And he was very upset as he shouted and puffed, what's that thing you've made out of my truffle tuft? Look, Lorax, I said, there's no cause for alarm. I chopped just one tree. I'm doing no harm. I'm being quite useful. This thing is a need to find something that all people need. It's a shirt, it's a sock, it's a glove, it's a hat, but it has other uses far beyond that. You can use it for carpets, for pillows, for sheets, or curtains or covers for bicycle seats. The Lorax said, Sir, you are crazy with greed. There is no one on earth who would buy that fool's need. But at that very minute, I proved he was wrong. For just at that minute, a chap came along and he thought that the need I had knitted was great, and he happily bought it for $3.98. I laughed at the Lorax. You poor stupid guy. You never can tell what some people will buy. Oh, let's just pass all the ugliness by and get to the end here, where, of course, if you know the story, you know that greed overtook the story. And instead of the beautiful truffula, the story gets dark. No more trees, no more needs, no more work to be done. So in no time, my uncles and aunts, everyone, all waved me goodbye. They jumped into my cars and drove away under the smoke-smuggered skies. Now that all that was left beneath the bad-smelling sky was my big, empty factory, the Lorax, and I. The Lorax said nothing, just gave me a glance, just gave me a very sad, backward glance as he lifted himself by the seat of his pants. And I'll never forget the grim look on his face when he hoisted himself and took leave of this place through a hole in the smog without leaving a trace. And all that the Lorax left here in this mess was a small pile of rocks with one word, unless. Whatever that meant, for I just couldn't guess. That was long ago. But each day since that, I've sat here and worried away. Through the years while my buildings have fallen apart, I've worried about it with all of my heart. But now, says the Onceler, now that you're here, the word of the Lorax seems perfectly clear. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. So, catch, said the Onceler, and he let something fall. It's a truffle seed. It's the last one of all. You're in charge of the last of the truffle seeds, and the truffle trees are what everyone needs. Plant a new truffle, treat it with care, give it clean water and feed it fresh air. Grow a forest, protect it from axes that hack. Then the Lorax and all of his friends may come back.
she's got a great American classic here.
That's a tough act to follow. I'll try.
That's why we have actors come read too.
Yeah.
Dancers.
So this is To Kill a Mockingbird, and as you all know, in this book, Tom Robinson, a black man, is accused of raping a white woman, and this is the scene when the verdict is announced. And it's told from the point of view of Scout, who's 6 years old, and she and her brother Jem are in the courtroom, and their father, Atticus Finch, is the lawyer. "Ain't it a long time?" I asked him. "Sure is, Scout," he said happily. "Well, from the way you put it, it'd take just 5 minutes. Jem raised his eyebrows. "There are things you don't understand," he said, and I was too weary to argue. But I must have been reasonably awake, or I would not have received the impression that was creeping into me. It was not unlike one I had last winter, and I shivered, though the night was hot. The feeling grew until the atmosphere in the courtroom was exactly the same as a cold February morning when the mockingbirds were still and the carpenters had stopped hammering on Miss Maudie's new house, and every wood door in the neighborhood was shut as tight as the doors of the Radley place. A deserted, waiting, empty street, and the courtroom was packed with people. A steaming summer night was no different from a winter morning. Mr. Heck Tate, who had entered the courtroom and was talking to Atticus, might have been wearing his high boots and lumber jacket. Atticus had stopped his tranquil journey and had put his foot into the bottom rung of the chair as he listened to what Mr. Tate was saying. He ran his hand slowly up and down his thigh. I expected Mr. Tate to say any minute, "Take him, Mr. Finch." But Mr. Tate said, "This court will come to order," in a voice that rang with authority, and the heads below us jerked up. Mr. Tate left the room and returned with Tom Robinson. He steered Tom to his place beside Atticus and stood there. Judge Taylor had roused himself to sudden alertness and was sitting up straight, looking at the empty jury box. What happened after that had a dreamlike quality. In a dream, I saw the jury return, moving like underwater swimmers, and Judge Taylor's voice from far away was tiny. I saw something only a lawyer's child could be expected to see, could be expected to watch for, and it was like watching Atticus walk into the street, raise a rifle to his shoulder and pull the trigger, but watching all the time, knowing that the gun was empty. The jury never looks at a defendant it has convicted, and when this jury came in, not one of them looked at Tom Robinson. The foreman handed a piece of paper to Mr. Tate, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. I shut my eyes. Judge Taylor was polling the jury. Guilty, 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 guilty. I peeked at Jem. His hands were white from gripping the balcony, and his shoulders jerked as if guilty was a separate stab between them. Judge Taylor was saying something. His gavel was in his fist, but he wasn't using it. Dimly, I saw Atticus pushing papers from the table into his briefcase. He snapped it shut, went to the court reporter and said something, nodded to Mr. Gilmer, and then went to Tom Robinson and whispered something to him. Atticus put his hand on Tom's shoulder as he whispered. Atticus took his coat off the back of his chair and pulled it over his shoulder. Then he left the courtroom, but not by his usual exit. He must have wanted to go home the short way because he walked quickly down the middle aisle toward the south exit. I followed the top of his head as he made his way to the door. He did not look up. Someone was punching me, but I was reluctant to take my eyes from the people below us and from the image of Atticus' lonely walk down the aisle. Miss Jean Louise. I looked around. They were standing all around us and in the balcony on the opposite wall. The Negroes were getting to their feet. Reverend Sykes' voice was as distant as Judge Taylor's. Miss Jean Louise, stand up. Your father's passing.
I am here to read a book that I love, Where the Wild Things Are, and I think probably everyone has read it, but when I found out it was banned, I was a little shocked. I actually was like, what? So I looked into it to make sure I hadn't made a huge error in reading this to my child. If I did, it's too late. She loves it. Some of the history that I got on it was that the author actually spent 4 years in a tug of war with his editors over the content of the storyline, and he stayed true to it. And finally, the editors went, "All right, you win." Another thing that I'd like to point out is that the title is actually, I guess the author was inspired by something his mother called him in Yiddish when he was younger. And if you know Yiddish, excuse me, I may not say this right, but it was Wildi Chaya. Does anyone know Yiddish? Does that sound right? And it really means a boisterous child. So I thought that was really interesting, especially around the holidays. And of course it was honored, and it's just ridiculous that it was even banned. But I'm here to read it to you, and I'm going to show you the pictures as I do it. Where the Wild Things Are. Let's see. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind. And another. He's got the fork, the dog, bad boy. His mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That very night in Max's room, a forest grew. And grew. And grew until his ceiling hung with vines and the walls became the world all around. And an ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max, and he sailed off through night and day. And in and out of weeks and almost over a year, to where the wild things are. And when he came to the place where the wild things are, they roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. Till Max said, "Be still," and tamed them with the magic trick of staring into all their yellow eyes without blinking once. And they were frightened and called him the most wild thing of all, and made him king of all wild things. "And now," cried Max, "let the wild rumpus start." Rumpus, rumpus, rumpus. Rumpus, rumpus, rumpus. Rumpus, rumpus, rumpus. "Now stop," Max said, and sent the wild things off to bed without their supper. And Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are. But the wild things cried, "Oh, please, don't go. We'll eat you up. We love you so." And Max said, "No." The wild things roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. But Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye and sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day, and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. That just touches my heart, that it was still hot. His mother loved him enough to feed him. And that was one of the things that they were really upset about. In March of 1969, a child psychologist called the book in the Ladies' Home Journal, so this was big back then. He called it psychologically damaging for 3 to 4-year-olds because he was sent to bed without food, which isn't true because he gets food at the end. The book was heavily banned in the American South during its release, and challenges over the years which have been made is that the pictures themselves promote witchcraft and supernatural elements. Well, 19 million copies have been sold worldwide, and 10 million alone, and probably every one of you owned one. One thing that I really wanted to point out that I found out was that the author actually, this is really great, he actually, every Sunday, his aunts and uncles would come over, like on a Sunday, and they would kiss him and hug him. And he said that it was so traumatic and so awful, and they all had these bloodshot eyes and these yellow teeth. And he actually made these portraits of them. So this book had been in a long time in the making. And when I looked at some of the photos, I saw it. There's his aunts and his uncles. And they're all wanting to kiss him and hug him. And can you imagine he stared them down and said, "No!" and went into his own little world. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Number 2, an Alexandria resident and a poet frequently published in the Gazette, is going to read to us, and I'll let you introduce your book.
I'm reading from Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, which was banned by the Soviet Russian government because of its sympathy to Russian traditions, including the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian press hounded and criticized Pasternak mercilessly. He was denied permission to travel abroad to accept the Nobel Prize for Literature for Dr. Zhivago. So, I'm reading from a section about the death of Anna Ivanovna's, and she is the foster mother of Dr. Zhivago, Yura Zhivago. Yura's parents died when he was a child. Tanya is Anna's natural daughter. Yura Zhivago and Tanya are entering emerging adults. They refers to Yura and Tanya. So here's a section about the death of Anna. They did not find Anna Ivanovna alive. When they ran up the stairs to her room, she had been dead for 10 minutes. The cause of death had been an attack of suffocation resulting from acute edema of the lungs. This had not been diagnosed in time. For the first few hours, Tanya screamed, sobbed convulsively, and recognized no one. On the following day, she calmed down, but could only nod in answer to anything that Yura and her father said to her. Each time she tried to speak, her grief overpowered her, and she began to scream again as if she were possessed. In the intervals between the services, she knelt for hours beside the dead woman, her large, fine hands clasping a corner of the coffin standing on its dais, covered with wreaths. She was oblivious of the people around her. But whenever her eyes met those of her friends, she would get up quickly and hurry from the room and up the stairs, repressing her sobs until she fell on the bed and buried her bursts of despair in the pillow. Sorrow, standing for many hours on end, lack of sleep, the deep-toned singing, and the dazzling candles by night and day, as well as the cold he had caught, filled Yura's soul with a sweet confusion, a fever of grief and anxiety. When his mother had died 10 years earlier, he had been a child. He could still remember how he had cried, grief-stricken and terrified. In those days, he had not been primarily concerned with himself. He could hardly even realize that such a being as Yura existed on its own or had any value or interest. What mattered then was everything outside and around him. From every side of the external world pressed in on him, dense, intangible, as a forest. And the reason he had been so shaken by his mother's death was that at her side, he had lost himself in the forest, suddenly to find her gone and himself alone in it. The forest was made up of everything in the world, clouds and shop signs, the golden tops of belfries, and the bare-headed riders who went as escort before the holy image of the Mother of God, carried in a coach. Shop fronts were in it, and arcades, and the inaccessibly high, star-studded sky, and the Lord God and the saints. This inaccessibly high sky once came down all the way to his nursery, as far as his nurse's skirt when she was talking to him about God. It was close and within reach, like the tops of hazel trees in the gullies when you pull down their branches and pick the nuts. It was as if it were dipped into the gilt nursery wash basin and, having bathed in fire and gold, re-emerged as the morning service or mass at the tiny church where he went with his nurse. There the heavenly stars became the lights before the icons, and the Lord God was a kindly Father, and everything more or less fell into its right place. But the main thing was the real world of the grown-ups and the city that loomed up all around him like a forest. At that time, with the whole of his half-animal faith, Ura believed in God, who was the keeper of that forest. Now, it was quite different. In his 12 years at gymnasium and university, Ura had studied the classics and scripture, legends and poets, history and natural science, which had become to him the chronicles of his house, his family tree. Now he was afraid of nothing, neither of life nor of death. Everything in the world, all the things in it, were words in his vocabulary. He felt he was on equal footing with the universe. And he was affected by the services of Anna Ivanovna differently than he had been by the services for his mother. Then he had prayed in confusion, fear, and pain. Now he listened to the services as if they were a message addressed to him and concerning him directly. He listened intently to the words, expecting them, like any other words, to have a clear meaning. There was no religiosity in his reverence for the supreme powers of heaven and earth, which he worshipped as his progenitors. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and deathless, have mercy on us. What was it? Where was he? They must be talking out of the coffin. He must wake up. They must be taking out the coffin. He must wake up. He had fallen asleep in his clothes on the sofa at 6 a.m. Now they were hunting for him all over the house. But no one thought of looking in the far corner of the library behind the bookshelves. Ura, Ura, Markel was calling him. They were taking out the coffin. Markel would have to carry the wreaths, and nowhere could he find Ura to help him. To make matters worse, he got stuck in the bedroom where the wreaths were piled up because the door of the wardrobe on the landing had swung open and blocked that of the bedroom. Markel, Markel, Ura! People were shouting from downstairs. Markel kicked open the door and ran downstairs carrying several wreaths. Holy God, holy and mighty, holy and deathless, the words drifted softly down the street and stayed there, as if a feather duster had softly brushed the air. Everything was swaying. Wreaths, passers-by, plumed horses' heads, the censer swinging on its chain from the priest's hand, and the white earth underfoot. Ura, my God, at last! Shura Schlesinger was shaking his shoulder. What's the matter with you? They're carrying out the coffin. Are you coming with us? Yes, of course. The funeral service was over. The beggars, shuffling their feet in the cold, closed up in two ranks. The hearse, the gig with wreaths on it, and the Kruger's carriage stirred and swayed slightly. The cabs drew closer to the church. Out of it came Shura Schlesinger crying. Lifting her veil, damp with tears, she cast a searching glance at the crowd, spotted the pallbearers, beckoned to them, and went back into the church. More and more people were pouring out. Well, so now it's Anna Ivanovna's turn. She sends her best regards. She took a ticket to a far place. Poor soul. Yes, her dance is over. Poor cricket, she's gone to her rest. Have you got a cab, or are you going to walk? I need to stretch my legs after all that standing. Let's walk a bit, and then we'll take a cab. Did you see how upset Fukov was? Looking at her, tears pouring down his face, blowing his nose, staring at her face, standing next to her husband at that. He always had his eye on her. They slowly made their way to the cemetery at the other end of town. That night, the hard frost had broken. It was a still, heavy day. The cold had gone, and the life had gone too. It was a day as though made for a funeral. The dirty snow looked as if it shone through crepe. and the firs behind the churchyard railings, wet and dark like tarnished silver, seemed to be in deep mourning. It was in the same churchyard that Ura's mother lay buried. He had not been to her grave in recent years. He glanced in its direction and whispered, "Mother," almost as he might have done years before. They dispersed solemnly in picturesque groups along the cleared paths whose meanderings did not harmonize with the sorrowful deliberation of their step. Alexander Alexandrovich led Tanya by the arm. They were followed by the Krugers. Black was very becoming to Tanya. Hoarfrost, bearded like mold, sprouted on the chains with crosses hanging from the domes and on the pink monastery walls. In the far corner of the monastery yard, washing hung on lines stretching from wall to wall, shirts with heavy sodden sleeves, peach-colored tablecloths badly wrung out, and crookedly fastened sheets. Ura realized that this, altered in appearance by the new buildings, was the part of the monastery grounds where the blizzard had raged that night. That night there is the night that his mother was buried. His mother was buried, and that night there was a blizzard. He walked on alone, ahead of the others, stopping occasionally to let them catch up with him. In answer to the desolation brought by death to the people slowly pacing after him, he was drawn as irresistibly as water funneling downward to dream, to think, to work out new forms, to create beauty. More vividly than ever before, he realized that art has two constant, two unending concerns. It always meditates on death and thus always creates life. All great, genuine art resembles and continues the revelation of St. John. With joyful anticipation, he thought of the day or two which he would set aside and spend alone, away from the university and from his home, to write a poem in memory of Anna Ivanovna. He would include all those random thoughts that life had sent his way, a few descriptions of Anna Ivanovna's best characteristics, Tanya in mourning, street incidents on the way back from the funeral, and the washing hanging in the place where many years ago the blizzard had raged and he had wept as a child.
So every year I use the Banned Books week to look over the list, and I use it as a measurement of how good I am as a father. I think I've read all the children's books that are banned to my children, and then found out, wow, that's great. And then all the other books I think I read it in high school. So that's a testament of my upbringing, I guess. So today I'm going to read one of those classic books, The Adventures of Captain Underpants. And I couldn't find our paper copy. It's buried underneath all the other banned books in my children's room somewhere. So I have to read it off my my iPad here. So please bear with me. George and Harold. Meet George Beard and Harold Hutchins. George is the kid on the left with the flat top. Harold is the one on the right, the t-shirt and the bad haircut. Remember that now. George and Harold were best friends. They had a lot in common. They lived right next door to each other. They were both in the same 4th grade class at Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. George and Harold were usually responsible kids. Whenever anything bad happened, George and Harold were usually responsible. But don't get the wrong idea about these two. George and Harold were actually very nice boys, no matter what everyone else thought. They were good, sweet, and lovable. Well, okay, maybe not, maybe they weren't so sweet and lovable, but they were good nonetheless. It's just that George and Harold each had a silly streak a mile long. Usually that silly streak was hard to control. Sometimes it got them into trouble. And once it got them into big, big trouble. And once it got them, but before I tell you that story, I'll have to tell you this story. Chapter 2 is Treehouse Comics Incorporated. After a hard day of cracking jokes, pulling pranks, and causing mayhem at school, George and Harold liked to rush the old treehouse in George's backyard. Inside the treehouse were 2 big old fluffy chairs, a table, a cupboard crammed with junk food, and a padlocked crate filled with pencils, pens, and stacks of paper. Now, Harold loved to draw, and George loved to make up stories. And together, the two boys spent hours and hours writing and drawing their very own comic books. Over the years, they had created hundreds of their own comics, starring dozens of their own superheroes. First, there was Dogman. Then, Timmy the Talking Toilet. And who could forget the Amazing Cow Lady? But all-time greatest superhero they ever made up had to be the amazing Captain Underpants. George came up with the idea, most superheroes look like they're flying around in their underwear. He said, well, this guy actually is flying around in his underwear. The two boys laughed and laughed. Yeah, said Harold, he could fight with wedgie power. George and Harold spent entire afternoons writing and drawing the comic adventures of Captain Underpants. It was the coolest superhero ever. So basically, they would then take their comic books, and when the secretary in their school wasn't watching the copier, they would make photocopies of it and sell it out in the playground. So they had the adventures of Captain Underpants, doing all sorts of crazy things that they would sell in their school. So chapter 4, Mean Old Mr. Krupp. Do you see that old guy looking out the window up there? That's Mr. Krupp, the principal. Now, Mr. Krupp was the meanest, sourest old principal in the whole history of Jerome Horwitz Elementary School. He hated laughter and singing. He hated the sound of children playing at recess. In fact, he hated children altogether. And guess which two children Mr. Krupp hated most of all? You guessed it, George and Harold. Mr. Krupp hated George and Harold. He hated their pranks and their wisecracks. He hated their silly attitudes, their constant giggling, and he especially hated those awful Captain Underpants comic books. I'm going to get those boys one day, Mr. Krupp vowed. One day, very, very soon. Chapter 5, one day, very, very soon. So in that chapter, essentially, George and Harold go to the big football game in their school, and they do such pranks like rearrange the marquee that says, see our big football game today, to say, gee, don't our feet really smell? Rearranging the letters. They put pepper in the pom-poms of the cheerleaders, so when they cheered, they all sneezed. They filled the tubas in the band with soap to create bubbles. They replaced the athletic cream for the football players with itching powder. Things like that. So we get to the part where their principal caught them. And this is a chapter called Busted. The next day at school, an announcement came over to loudspeakers. George Beard and Harold Hutchins, please report to Mr. Krupp's office at once. Uh-oh, said Harold. I don't like the sound of that. Don't worry, said George. They can't prove anything. George and Harold entered Principal Krupp's office and sat down on the chairs in front of his desk. The two boys had been in the office together countless times before, but this time was different. Mr. Krupp was smiling. And as long as George and Harold had known Mr. Krupp, they had never, ever seen him smile. Mr. Krupp knew something. I don't see you boys at the big game yesterday, said Mr. Krupp. No, said George. We weren't feeling well. Yeah, Harold stammered nervously. We went home. Aw, that's too bad, said Principal Krupp. You boys missed a good game. George and Harold quickly glanced at each other, gulped, and tried hard not to look guilty. Luckily for you, I have a videotape of the whole thing, Mr. Krupp said. He turned on the television in the corner and pressed the play button on the VCR. A black and white image appeared on the TV screen, It was an overhead shot of George and Harold sprinkling pepper into the cheerleaders' pom-poms. Next came a shot of George and Harold pouring liquid bubble bath into the marching band's instruments. "How do you like the pregame show?" asked Mr. Krupp with a devilish grin. George eyed the television screen in terror. He couldn't answer. Harold's eyes were glued to the floor. He couldn't look. The tape went on, revealing all of George and Harold's behind-the-scenes antics. By now, both boys were eyeing the floor, squirming nervously, and dripping with sweat. Mr. Krupp turned off the TV. So, basically, he makes them sign a pledge that they will not do any more pranks. And then they have to do things, or basically, if they do any more pranks and don't listen, he's going to give that tape to the football team. Yes. So, and that leads to chapter 7, a little blackmail. They were both made to wash Mr. Krupp's car, trim his fingernails, and all sorts of other things. But they decided to get back at him they said, basically, we wanted to do this for about 9 or 10 years, then we can move away somewhere. And one of them had the better idea to say they'll get one of those hypno rings. And they hypnotized Mr. Krupp, and to make a long story short, which is actually one of the chapters, to make a long story short, they turned him into all sorts of things, a monkey and a rooster, and they turned him into Captain Underpants, where he ripped off his clothes and jumped out the window. And then they did things like he foiled real crimes, being Captain Underpants, and they tried to get him back to the school, and they foiled the evil Dr. Diaper and all sorts of other capers. And then they tried to dehypnotize him, and it didn't work. And so what they did was they splashed water on their principal, and they asked, well, why did he do that? He said, well, I saw it in a cartoon once, so it has to work. And he came to, and he became their principal again, and they were thinking, phew, that was close. And the last chapter is called The End, ? Is where they were looking at the instructions for the hypno ring, and they were throwing them in the trash, and on the back of it says, whatever you do, never pour water on someone when they're in a trance state, because it will make them switch back and forth between reality and their hypnotic self, and you'll never know what's going to happen. So then that's the end of the story, essentially, where the football team is hypnotized, and their principal is, again, Captain Underpants. So, thank you.
Hi. Nice to meet you all. I'm a resident of Alexandria, and some of you may know Patty Bowman, who is a neighbor of mine in Rosemont, and she enticed me to come and read a book here. She's also a member of we're members of the same book club, so we do enjoy reading together. This is a little bit of a change of pace. This book that I will be talking about and reading from is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. And when I mentioned it to Catherine, she said, oh yes, I remember reading it, I guess in high school, and it was powerful. And that was my memory too, how powerful it was. It's not, sections of it are not easy to read, not easy to listen to, and that's the power that it does have. It was published in 1906 by Upton Sinclair, who was a prominent writer, a socialist, muckraker, wanted to change the way how things were going in America. And it's the story of Jurgis Rutkus, a Lithuanian immigrant, and his family, who come to Chicago full of hope and dreams, as so many other immigrants were coming at that time in the early part of the 20th century. And it's the story of their descent into hell, the story of working in the stockyards and in the packing plants, of the family broken apart. Literally the women are defiled, the men are killed. And Jurgis has this journey through this wilderness, really, And he sees not only the stockyards and the packing plants, but he comes up against the political machine of Chicago. And finally, at the end, he comes to socialism, and he turns to socialism and wants to be a revolutionary. Now, what happens in the book, and what happened at that time in America, was that the reaction was so great, not so much because it was a polemic against capitalism, but it talked so much about the conditions of food processing and what people were eating or not eating. And that helped to galvanize people and behind the progressive movement, and helped to move legislation under Theodore Roosevelt to make some changes. So I'm going to read two sections. I hope we're not having any pork in our for our repast later. But let me just read two excerpts quickly. Apparently, the packing plants actually allowed folks to come in and tour the slaughtering. So I'll start with this. It was a long, narrow room with a gallery along it for visitors. At the head, there was a great iron wheel about 20 feet in circumference with rings here and there along its edges. Upon both sides of this wheel, there was a narrow space into which came the hogs at the end of their journey. In the midst of them stood a great burly Negro, bare-armed and bare-chested. He was resting for the moment, for the wheel had stopped while men were cleaning up. In a minute or two, however, it began slowly to revolve. And then the men upon each side of it sprang to work. They had chains which they fastened around the leg of the nearest hog, and the other end of the chain they hooked into one of the rings upon the wheel. So as the wheel turned, a hog was suddenly jerked off its feet and borne aloft. At the same instant, the ear was assailed by a most terrifying shriek. The visitors started in alarm. The women turned pale and shrank back. The shriek was followed by another, louder and yet more agonizing, for once started upon the journey, the hog never came back. At the top of the wheel, he was shunted off upon a trolley and went sailing down the room. And meantime, another was swung up, and then another, until there was a double line of them, each dangling by a foot and kicking in frenzy and squealing. The uproar was appalling, perilous to the eardrums. One feared there was too much sound for the room to hold, that the walls must give way or the ceiling crack. There were high squeals and low squeals, grunts and wails of agony. There would come a momentary lull and then a fresh outburst, louder than ever, surging up to a deafening climax. It was much too much for some of the visitors. The men would look at each other, laughing nervously, and the women would stand with hands clenched and the blood rushing to their faces and tears starting in their eyes. Meantime, heedless of all these things, the men upon the floor were going about their work. Neither squeals of hogs nor tears of visitors made any difference to them. One by one, they hooked up the hogs, and one by one, with a swift stroke, they slit their throats. There was a long line of hogs with squeals and lifeblood ebbing away together, until at each started again and vanished with a splash into a huge vat of boiling water. However, not everything was visible for visitors to come see what really happened in some of the processing areas. It was only when the whole ham was spoiled that it came into the department of Elsbeta. This is one of Jurgis's relatives. Cut up by the 2,000 revolutions a minute flyers and mixed with a half-ton of other meat, no odor that ever was in a ham could make any difference. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. Some would come all the way back from Europe, old sausage that had been rejected and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and glycerin and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had been tumbled on the floor in the dirt and sawdust, where the workers had trampled and split uncounted billions of consumption germs. There would be meat stored in high piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the men who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. There were butt ends of smoked meat and the scraps of corned beef and all the odds and ends of the waste of the plants that would be dumped into old barrels in the cellar and left there. Under the system of rigid economy which the packers enforced, there were some jobs that it only paid to do once in a long time, and one of these was the cleaning out of the waste barrels. Every spring they did it, and in the barrels would be dirt and rust and old nails and stale water, and cartload after cartload of it would be taken and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out to the public's breakfast. Some of it they would make into smoked sausage, but as the smoking took time and was therefore expensive, they would call upon their chemistry department and preserve it with borax and color it with gelatin to make it all brown. All of their sausage came out of the same bowl, but when they came to wrap it, they would stamp some of it special, and that they would charge 2 cents more a pound. Interestingly enough, this book was banned by the Nazis and was actually among the books that were burned. But East Germany also banned it in 1956 as hostile to communism. So the book must be doing something right if both ends of the spectrum didn't like it. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this is the same author of Where the Wild Things Are, and several of Maurice Sendak's books are on the most frequently banned list. But I think this is one of the most innocent books in the world, but it is easy to see why someone took issue to it, because he does lose his pajamas in the beginning. In the Night Kitchen. Did you ever hear of Mickey? How he heard a racket in the night? Thump, dump, clump, lump, bump. And shouted, "Quiet down there!" And fell through the dark, out of his clothes, past the moon and his mama and his papa sleeping tight. Into the light of the night kitchen, where the bakers who bake till the dawn so we can have cake in the morn mix Mickey in batter, chanting, "Milk in the batter, milk in the batter, stir it, scrape it, make it, bake it." And they put that batter up to bake a delicious Mickey cake. But right in the middle of the steaming and the making and the smelling and the baking, Mickey poked through and said, "I'm not the milk and milk's not me, I'm Mickey." So he skipped from the oven and into the bread dough, all ready to rise in the night kitchen. He kneaded it and punched it and pounded and pulled till it looked okay. Then Mickey in dough was just on his way. When the bakers ran up with a measuring cup, howling, "Milk, milk, milk for the morning cake." "What's all the fuss? I'm Mickey the pilot. I'll get milk the Mickey way." And he grabbed the cup as he flew up and over the top of the Milky Way in the night kitchen. Mickey the milkman dived down to the bottom, singing, "I'm in the milk and the milk's in me. God bless milk and God bless me." Then he swam to the top, pouring milk from his cup into the batter below. And the bakers, they mixed it and beat it and baked it. "Milk in the batter, we bake cake and nothing's the matter." Now Mickey in the night kitchen cried, "Cock-a-doodle-doo," and slid down the slide straight into bed, carefree and dried. Oh, ho, hum, yum. And that's why, thanks to Mickey, we have cake every morning.
Next, we have our city historian, Lance Malava, and I don't know what he's going to read, but I know it's going to be special.
So, I'm only going to read section 11 because I don't want to use up all our time here tonight. This poem, Song of Myself, kind of wanders all over the place. As I said, it has 52 parts. This is only one. And I do urge you to read the entire poem because it is truly amazing. And this section, I'll call it 29 Bathers. 28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men, and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life, and all so lonesome. She owns the house by the rise of the bank. She hides handsome and richly dressed at the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stocked still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them, and she loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed all over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men floated on their backs, their white bellies bulged to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they spouse with spirit.
First, Poet Laureate of Alexandria. Thank you.
I had the privilege this summer of going to Chautauqua in New York, and also the added privilege of hearing Frank X. Walker read some of his poetry. And when he said, and the Kentucky school system banned this book, I practically jumped up and said, okay, I've got it for this fall. So I've brought it along, and I'm going to read you 3 and blessedly brief poems. This book is about a slave who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their explorations of the country, the Louisiana Purchase. And York was the slave of William Clark. And this tells the story of their travels from his perspective. And it's quite interesting. At the beginning, he's talking about the captain. These last 2 are poems about when they returned after being pretty much free during this entire exploration and being actually honored by the Indians through the exploration. York comes back and is expected to resume his old role again as slave. This is a poem that he talks about his wife. And the next poem is his wife's thinking about him. So this is York's perspective, to have and to hold. It do more harm than good to be enslaved and agree to love forever when there be folks over us with even more power than death to do us apart. Being another man's property, alls I can promise is, when we're in the same quarters, no one will hold you closer or with more tenderness than me. If ever I have to choose between another day of service and death, I will always choose living. Even if Massa sell me down the Mississippi tomorrow or pair me up with another woman to breed, I will only think on what we had and chase away thoughts of what we had not. I aims to see you every Sunday and Christmas, but if ever I'm away more than 2 whole seasons without sending back word, untie the ribbons from that broom we jump. Mourn for me but a little. Then set your mind to figuring on how you gonna stay warm when winter come. what he explained is that on Sundays and Christmas were the only days that slave men were entitled to be with their wives. Then this is his wife's thoughts, called Real Costs. Somewhere out there, he learned to touch me like I'm a woman, and not just some woman, me. In our marriage bed, he seemed as interested in pleasing me as he be in spilling himself. I knew he'd come back changed when new words fall out his mouth like love and freedom and manhood, and there come a look in his eye like he owned all three, free and clear, and don't need no papers to prove it. But it scared me, because I seen that look in many a black eye before white hammers nailed it shut, or left it frozen open and swinging to teach the rest what anything that smelled like courage cost. I have no doubt he'd give his life to stay with me, so I don't tell him that Massa has taken me back down south. I just kiss him soft to sleep and stare at him long enough to call up his face when I gets old, and thankful he still be breathing somewhere when winter comes.
Thank you for sharing that. Eloise? Eloise is a storyteller and performer, and you may have seen her work here or at the Fringe Festival in D.C.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I have to cross the river to come from Maryland, but I've come often since Catherine's been here to tell stories, and so I feel very at home here. Thank you. I've chosen to read tonight from Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. When I looked at the list, there were so many books that you've already touched and are going to touch that I really would have liked to have done, but I felt pulled to this book, not that I like it, because I never have. You know, really, not even in the movies. It just wasn't a story that grasped me, but for the past year and a half, I've been reading about World War I, the battlefields and whatever, because I have a story called The Hello Girls, women who went to the battlefield. So you may not know about them, but there were some. So I chose to read this because, as it says, it's the best American novel to emerge from World War I. It's the unforgettable story of the American ambulance driver on the Italian front and his passion for a beautiful English nurse. Hemingway's frank portrayal of the love between Lieutenant Henry and Catherine Barclay, caught in the inexorable sweep of war, glows with intensity unrivaled in modern literature, but it goes on to say that it's his ability to really describe the warfare, to bring that close. I chose, although it was banned, for the pornography and for some of the socialist ideas that he puts in here. I'm choosing to read you a passage of the battlefield, because he truly does, in my opinion, bring this right flat up. I'm going to start in the middle of a passage just to give you a feeling for that, where he is an American Red Cross volunteer before the U.S. enters the war in 1917. He is a non-combatant. He is an ambulance driver. At this particular point, he is leading a group of 4 ambulances up atop of the hillside where they're stopped at a treatment center, waiting for bombardment and the battle to take place. And the Austrians, they expect to bombard them. This is the Italian army that's there, and they are expecting, and they know. They get up there, the battle has been moved forward an hour. So they don't have time to get to the safety. This is really heavy. They don't have time to get to the safest place. But in this trench-like road that they've driven up on, there are dugouts, caves that they've dug out in the moist mud. And so they take refuge in one of those. while they're waiting for the bombs to fall and the shooting to start, they had gotten home with some cold macaroni and cheese, and they'd been eating. I ate the end of my piece of cheese and took a swallow of wine. Through the other noise, I heard a cough, and then then there was a flash as when a blast furnace door is swung open, and the roar that started white and went red and on in a rushing wind. I tried to breathe, but my breath would not come, and I felt myself rush bodily out of myself, and out and out and out, and all the time bodily in the wind. I went out swiftly, all of myself, and I knew I was dead, and that it had all been a mistake to think that you just died. Then I floated, and instead of going on, I felt myself slide back. I breathed, and I was back. The ground was torn up, and in front of my head there was a splintered beam of wood. In the jokes of my head, I heard somebody crying. I thought somebody was screaming. I tried to move, but I could not move. I heard the machine guns and rifles firing across the river and along the river. There was a great splashing, and I saw the star shells go up and burst and float quietly, and rockets going up, and heard the bombs, all this in a moment. And then I heard, close to me, someone say, "Mamma Mia! Oh, Mamma Mia!" I pulled and twisted and got my legs loose, finally, and turned around and touched him. It was Cassini, and when I touched him, he screamed. His legs were toward me, and I saw in the dark and the light that they were both snatched above the knee. One leg was gone, and the other was held by tendons, and part of the trouser and the stump twitched and jerked as though it was not moving. He bit his arm and moaned, "Oh, Mamma Mia, Deo te salve, Maria, Deo te salve, Maria." Oh, Jesus, shoot me. Christ, shoot me. Mamma Mia, Mama, Mama, oh, purest, lovely Mary, shoot me. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Jesus, lovely Mary, stop it. Oh, then, oh, Mamma Mia. Then he was quiet, biting his arm, the stump of his leg twitching. Forte Ferenti, I called, holding my hands cupped. I tried to get closer to the scene to try to put a tourniquet on my legs, but I could not move. I tried again, and my legs moved a little. I could pull backward along with my arms and elbows. Cassini was quiet now. I sat beside him, undid my tunic, tried to rip the tail of my shirt. It would not rip. I bit the edge of the cloth to start it. Then I thought of his booties. I had on wool stockings, but Cassini wore cotton booties. All the tribes wore booties, but Cassini had only one leg. I unwound that bootie, and while I was doing it, I saw there was no need to try and make a tourniquet. He was dead already. I made sure he was dead. Thank you. That Hemingway himself would volunteer ambulance driver in World War I and was seriously injured. So that part of where he was writing about the battlefields is biographical. He knows what that was like. Thank you. 100th anniversary of that war, of the beginning of the war, was August, was it not? Yeah, August. Yeah, August. Our next speaker is our current poet laureate. The microphone. James Saunders, The Catcher in the Rye.
and she never really closed it all the way, her mouth. It was always just a little bit open, especially when she got in her golf stance or when she was reading a book. She was always reading, and she read very good books. She read a lot of poetry and all. She was the only one outside of my family that I ever showed Allie's baseball mitt to, with all the poems written on it. She never met Allie or anything, because that was the first summer in Maine. Before that, she went to Cape Cod, but I told her quite a lot about it. She was interested in that kind of stuff. My mother didn't like her too much. I mean, my mother always thought Jane and her mother were sort of snubbing her or something when they didn't say hello. My mother saw them in the village a lot because Jane used to drive to market with her mother, and it was LaSalle convertible they had. My mother didn't think Jane was pretty even. I did though. I just liked the way she looked. That's all. I remember this one afternoon. It was the only time old Jane and I ever got close to necking even. It was a Saturday, and it was raining like a bastard out, and I was over at her house on the porch. They had this big screened-in porch. We were playing checkers. I used to kid her once in a while because she wouldn't take her kings out of the back row. But I didn't kid her much, though. You never wanted to kid Jane too much. I think I really like it best when you can kid the pants off a girl when the opportunity arises, but it's a funny thing. The girls I like best are the ones I never feel much like kidding. Sometimes I think they'd like it if you kidded them. In fact, I know they would, but it's hard to get started once you've known them a pretty long time and never kidded them. Anyway, I was telling you about that afternoon. Jane and I came close to necking. It was raining like hell, and we were out on the porch, and all of a sudden this booze hound her mother was married to came out on the porch and asked Jane if there were any cigarettes in the house. I didn't know him too well or anything, but he looked like the kind of guy that wouldn't talk to you unless he wanted something off you. He had a lousy personality. Anyway, old Jane wouldn't answer him when he asked her if she knew where there were any cigarettes. So the guy asked her again, but she still wouldn't answer him. She didn't look up at him from the game. Finally, the guy went inside. When he did, I asked Jane what the hell was going on. She wouldn't even answer me then. She made out like she was concentrating on her next move in the game and all. Then all of a sudden, this tear popped down on the checkerboard, on one of the red squares. Boy, I can still see it. She just rubbed it into the board with her finger. I don't know why, but it bothered the hell out of me. So what I did was, I went over and made her move over on the glider so I could sit down next to her. I practically sat down in her lap, as a matter of fact. Then she really started to cry. And the next thing I knew, I was kissing her all over, anywhere. Her eyes, her nose, her forehead, her eyebrows and all, her ears, her whole face except her mouth and all. She sort of wouldn't let me get to her mouth. Anyway, it was the closest we ever got to necking. After a while, she got up and went in and put on this red and white sweater she had that knocked me out and we went to a goddamn movie. I asked her on the way, Mr. Cudahy, that was the booze hound's name, had ever tried to get wise with her. She was pretty young, but she had this terrific figure, and I wouldn't have put it past that Cudahy bastard. She said no, though. I never did find out what the hell was the matter. Some girls, you practically never find out what's the matter.
Great for books, proudly sells banned books in Alexandria. And last month had author Captain Underpants Dave Kilkey at the store. So we're doing our bit to promote banned books. I'm going to be reading a very, very short section from Harry Potter, just as Dave Kilkey's Captain Underpants was the most challenging book last year. The Harry Potter series, which first came to the United States in 1998, topped the banned books list from the year 2000 through 2009, and for all I know, up until Dave Kilkey. So we have a photograph, because of the dark themes, because of mysticism, and at the same time, it's been a New York Times bestseller. It's gotten awards, so there you go. Just as an example, in the year 2000, school principals in Santa Fe, Texas, voted to require written parental permission for kids at their schools to borrow any of the Harry Potter books from the school library, and that was the only book that required such permission. The following year, 2001, there were schools in Pennsylvania, Kansas school districts, Illinois, and Wyoming that just banned the book outright from being in the school libraries. But then there were also voices of reason, and I love this one. A committee in Whittier, California in the year 2000 rejected a request to remove the Harry Potter books from district school libraries, even though they had received a petition signed by 53 parents, charging that the series, which, quote, exposes our young children's minds to black magic and horrible experiences that our children don't need to hear or read about, close quote. The review committee countered, saying that if books were to be banned from schools due to violence depicted, then stories such as Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, and the Three Little Pigs would need to be added to the list. So, thank you for your help. The section I'm going to read is from the first book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Piers wanted to see huge, poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can. But at the moment, it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move," he whined at his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped on the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry was in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died in order itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. He got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its deep eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on a level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head toward Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling, gave Harry a look that said quite plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. It must be really annoying. The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at a little slide next to the glass. Harry peered at it. Boa constrictor, Brazil. "Was it nice there?" The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry went on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil?" As the snake shook its head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dudley! Come and look at the snake! You won't believe what snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, splintering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exit. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn a slow, low hissing voice said, "Still, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "The glass," he said. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Pierce and Dundee could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed, but by the time they were all back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Pierce was swearing it had tried to squeeze them to death. But worst of all for Harry, at least, was Pierce calming down enough to say, "Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Uncle Vernon waited until Pierce was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go, color, stay, no meals," before he collapsed into a chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy.
Well, this is an important event. It's unbelievable that books are banned and these great classics are banned. The list is very long. Song of Solomon, Toni Morrison's book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Adventures of Tom Sawyer. You've all read the list. Lucy's Catch-22, Canterbury Tales, Calling the Royal, and of course the Diary of Anne Frank. And so many, and all the things that you all have read. And I'm going to be reading from The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, which was written 75 years ago, in 1939, winner of the National Book Award, the Pulitzer Prize winner. John Steinbeck won the Pulitzer in large part because of The Grapes of Wrath. 14 million copies are sold, and now it is banned in some places in our country. It was actually banned pretty quickly after it was released. I'm just going to say a few words and then just review really quickly, but it was banned for reasons like indecent content, libelous content, and because it seemed to encourage communism. As most of us know, and will recall, set during the Great Depression and focuses on the Joad family, a poor family of tenant farmers. Tenant farmers driven from their Oklahoma home by drought, economic hardship, agricultural industry changes, and bank foreclosures, forcing the tenant farmers out of work. Due to their nearly hopeless situation, and in part because they were trapped in the Dust Bowl, the Joads set out for California. With thousands of Okies, they sought jobs, land, their dignity, and their future. I was going to read two short, very short excerpts. One is after they're setting out as a family, multi-generations, and the grandfather dies of the Joad family. And the father, the grandfather's son, says, Pa said, quote, "Won't you say a few words? Ain't none of our folks ever been buried without a few words." "I'll say 'em," said the preacher. Connie led Rose of Sharon to the graveside. She reluctant. "You got to," Connie said. "It ain't decent not to. It'll just be a little." The firelight fell on the group of people, showing their faces and their eyes, dwindling on their dark clothes. All the hats wore off now. The light danced, jerking over the people. Casey said, that's the preacher, quote, "It'll be a short one." He bowed his head, and the others followed his lead. Casey said solemnly, "This here old man just lived a life and just died out of it. I don't know whether he was good or bad, but that don't matter much. He was alive, and that's what matters. And now he's dead, and that don't matter." Heard a fella tell a poem one time, and he says, "All that lives is holy." Got to thinking, and pretty soon it means more than the word says. And I wouldn't pray for an old fellow that's dead. He's the others muttered, Amen. Then Pa took a shovel half filled with dirt, spread it gently into the black hole. He handed the shovel to Uncle Sean, and Sean dropped in a shovelful. Then the shovel went from hand to hand until every man had his turn. When all had taken their duty and their right, Pa tapped around the blue skirt, hurriedly filled with a pole. The women moved back to the fire to see supper. Ruthie and Winfield watched it absorbed. It is said that in the story, Grandpa didn't want to leave. So it's as if he didn't want to leave and he died. And really, I think one reason the Grapes of Wrath endures is because in recent years, in our country, of course, we've had tremendous hardship. Millions of American families who have never seen hardship and have been going to clinics to get health care and food, pantries to get food. And while the country seems to be getting back on its feet, we don't know that there are millions who are still underemployed or unemployed. So I really think that, and we don't know how many have died, obviously, because of these hardships in recent years, but I just think this story is just the way he captures this moment in time. And so because he captures a singular moment, it becomes universal. So the last little excerpt is towards the end. Tom Joad, the protagonist of the book, needs to leave, and he's saying goodbye to his family, but especially his mother today. And of course they don't know if they'll see each other, but he must go. And he says, Tom laughed uneasily. Well, maybe, like Casey says, a fellow ain't got a soul of his own, but only a piece of a big one. And then what, Tom? Then it don't matter. Then I'll be all around in the dark. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight, so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. If Casey knows, why, I'll be in the way guys yell when they're mad, and I'll be in the way kids laugh when they're hungry, and they know supper's ready. And when our folks eat and stuff, and when our folks eat the stuff they raise and live in the houses they build, why, I'll be there. See, God, I'm talking like Casey. Comes of thinking about him so much. Seems like I can see him sometimes. And I said, I don't understand. I don't really know. Me neither, said Tom. It's just stuff I've been thinking about. Get thinking a lot when you ain't moving around. You got to get back on. You take the money then. He was silent for a moment. All right, he said. And Tom, later when it's blowed over, you'll come back. You'll find us. Sure, he said. Now you better go. Here, give me your hand. He guided her toward the entrance. Her fingers clutched his wrist. He swept the vines aside and followed her out. Go up to the field till you come to a sycamore on the edge, and then cut across the stream. Goodbye. Goodbye, she said, and she walked quickly away. Her eyes were wet and burning, but she did not cry. Her footsteps were loud and careless on the leaves as she went through the brush, and as she went out of the dim sky, the rain began to fall, big drops and few, splashing on the dry leaves heavily. Ma stopped and stood still in the dripping thicket. She turned about, took 3 steps back toward the mounted vines, and then she turned quickly and went back toward the boxcar camp. She went straight out to the culvert and climbed up on the road. The rain had passed now, but the sky was overcast. Behind her on the road, she heard footsteps, and she turned nervously. The blinking of a dim flashlight played on the road. One turned back and started for home. In a moment, a man caught up with her. Politely, he kept his light on the ground, but did not play